There she is, the daughter who threw this whole family away. My mother said it the second I stepped through the front door of the house I grew up in, and she said it loud, the way you say a line you've practiced. 40 relatives turned to look at me. Somebody sighed. Somebody else did that little tisk with their tongue, the sound you make at a stain on a good tablecloth. My father stood beside her with his arms folded, nodding slowly, like a judge who had already read the verdict. 6 years ago, I found out where my grandmother's money was really going. When I said it out loud, they called me a thief and closed a door in my face. Today is the first anniversary of the day she died, and they invited the entire family back to this house to remember her and to remind everyone one more time that I am the one who abandoned her. I didn't argue. I never do in that room. I just took off my coat and let them look. Before I take you any further into that living room, do me one small favor. If you have ever been the person a family decided to blame, so the rest of them wouldn't have to look in a mirror, hit the like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I want to know who's in the room with me tonight. My name is Reese Carter. I'm 34 years old. I keep other people's books for a living. I count money for a job, and the reason that matters will become very clear before this is over. Because to understand why my mother needed that whole room to believe I was a monster, you have to go back 6 years, to a drawer in the same house and a stack of withdrawal slips that were never supposed to see daylight. But first, let me tell you what that living room felt like. You have to understand the choreography of it. This wasn't a family that happened to be angry at me. This was a family that had been managed. For 6 years, my parents had told a story so clean, so easy to repeat, that it had hardened into fact. The story was 3 sentences long. Reese found out Nana was sick and helpless. Reese drained Nana's accounts and disappeared. We stayed, we sacrificed, we paid for everything, and she never even called. 3 sentences. That's all it takes, if you say them enough times at enough dinners, to a room full of people who love a tidy villain because a tidy villain means none of them have to ask a harder question. So when I walked in, nobody was cruel to me exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was pity. My cousin Delia hugged me the way you hug someone at a hospital. My Uncle Ray shook my hand and held on to it a beat too long and said, "It's good you came, Reese. It's the right thing." As if my coming were a confession. As if showing up to my own grandmother's memorial were the first decent act I'd managed in years. I said thank you. I said it to all of them. Thank you, it's good to see you. Yes, it's been a long time. And the whole time my eyes kept going to the shelf. It was the same shelf that had been in that living room my entire life. Dark wood, a little warped in the middle from a leak in '99 that my grandfather never fixed. And on it, propped up where you couldn't miss it, was a framed letter. Cream paper, my grandmother's handwriting, matted and framed like a diploma. Somebody had given it a place of honor. I heard my Aunt Rhonda explaining it to one of the younger cousins. "That's the last thing Mama ever wrote," she said in a hush, like it was scripture. "She left it for the family. Isn't that beautiful? We keep it right there so she's always with us." I had to turn my face to the window so nobody could see it, because I recognized the frame. I'd have known it in the dark. It was the frame from my 5th birthday, the one with the little brass corners that my grandmother and I had picked out together at a craft store on a rainy Tuesday 29 years ago when I was 5 years old, and she let me hold the frame the whole car ride home like it was made of glass. They had no idea what they were keeping on that shelf. Not one of them. They walked past it every single day for a year and dusted it and got misty about it, and they had no idea. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Let me take you to the drawer. 6 years ago, I was 28 and I still had a key to this house. Back then, I came over every Sunday. My grandmother Vivian was 79 that year, and she was starting to slip, the small way people do first, before the big way. She'd repeat a story. She'd lose a word and have to walk around it. But she was sharp about the things that had always mattered to her, and money was one of them. My grandmother had worked 40 years as a school bookkeeper. She used to say a woman who could not read her own bank statement was a woman waiting to be robbed. She's the reason I do what I do. I learned to read a ledger sitting on her lap. So when she asked me that spring to help her sort out her accounts because the numbers were doing something funny, I didn't think much of it. She'd say that about a $2 bank fee. I sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and her checkbook and her long-term care statements, expecting to find nothing. I found something. There was an account I'd never seen. Her elder care fund, my grandfather had set it up before he passed, a substantial nest egg meant to cover exactly the years she was now entering. Close to $200,000, the last time she'd told me about it, held so she'd never have to worry about a nursing home, never be a burden, never have to ask her children for a dime. That was the whole point of it. That was her dignity, in an account. And it was bleeding out. Withdrawal after withdrawal. $1,200 here, $2,000 there. A $4,000 reimbursement with no receipt. Month after month, going back almost 2 years. And every single one authorized by a withdrawal slip with my grandmother's signature at the bottom. Except my grandmother hadn't signed them. I knew her signature the way you know a voice on the phone. She signed her V like a little sailboat, always had. These signatures were flat, careful, traced almost. Somebody had sat down and practiced my grandmother's name until they could do it well enough to fool a teller who wasn't looking hard. I sat in that kitchen with a cold cup of tea and did the thing my grandmother taught me to do. I didn't panic. I counted. And when I finished counting, the number was $31,000, gone from an old woman's account in 22 months, and I already knew, the way you know something in your stomach before your head catches up, exactly whose handwriting was pretending to be hers. I didn't say anything that Sunday. I told my grandmother the numbers were fine, kissed her forehead, and drove home and didn't sleep. Here's the part I need you to sit with because it's the hinge the whole rest of this turns on. I had a choice. I could have gone to a bank, a lawyer, the police, a stranger with a badge who owed my family nothing. That's what I'd tell you to do. That's what I'd tell anyone to do now. But she was my mother, he was my father, and there is a specific kind of person who, when they find out their own parents are stealing, still cannot quite believe it, still reaches for the version of the story where there's a reason, an emergency, a thing they'll explain, and then everyone will cry and it'll be okay. So I did the naive thing, the loving, stupid, naive thing. I went to them first. I picked a Sunday when my grandmother was napping. I laid the statements out on this same living room table, the withdrawal slips fanned out like a bad hand of cards, and I kept my voice as gentle as I could, and I said, I think there's a problem with Nana's accounts. I think somebody's been taking money. I want to understand what happened before I do anything. I gave them the door. I want you to notice that. I left the door wide open for a reason, an excuse, we borrowed it and we'll pay it back. I would have taken almost anything. My father looked at the papers for a long time. My mother didn't look at them at all. She looked at me. And my mother said in a voice I had never heard her use before, quiet and flat and final, You need to be very careful, Reese, about the next thing that comes out of your mouth. That was the moment. If you've ever had it, you know it. The moment the person you thought you knew turns their face a few degrees and you see the other one underneath, the one that was always there, and you understand that you are not in the conversation you thought you were in. I thought I was rescuing my grandmother. I found out I was threatening my parents. What happened over the next 3 weeks, I'll tell you, because it's where the whole shape of my life bent, and because you need to understand exactly how they built the lie, so that later, when it comes apart, you'll know it isn't luck. It's arithmetic. They moved fast, and they moved smart, and I've had 6 years to admire how smart it was, even while it was ruining me. First, they got ahead of the story. Within a week, my mother had called half the family to tell them, in tears, that she was so worried about Reese, that I'd been asking strange questions about Nana's money, that they'd caught me looking at the accounts. She didn't accuse me of anything, not out loud, not yet. She just planted the seed and watered it with worry. By the time I understood what she was doing, half a dozen relatives were already looking at me sideways. Second, they cut my access. My father changed the locks on this house for Nana's safety. He told my grandmother, whose memory he could already bend, that I'd been upsetting her and that maybe my Sunday visits were too much stimulation. He got a doctor's note. He was building a paper trail, and I didn't even know yet that we were in a war where paper was the weapon. Third, and this is the one that still takes my breath, they went to the bank and reported that they were concerned about unauthorized activity on my grandmother's accounts. They flagged it themselves. They walked into the branch. the two people who had drained that account, and they filed the concern first, so that when the withdrawals ever came to light, the record would show them as the ones who raised the alarm, and me as the one who'd had access and questions and a key. They didn't just steal from her, they built a frame and they hung my picture in it. By the end of that month, I had been to 3 lawyers, and every one of them told me some version of the same thing. Your grandmother is the victim, not you, and your grandmother is not asking for help. And your grandmother, when we call her, tells us her son handles her money and she trusts him completely, because your grandmother is beginning to forget which version of her son is real. Without her as a complaining witness, without access to the accounts you no longer have a key to, without money to fund a fight against 2 people who will testify you're the thief, you have a stack of photocopies and a story nobody in your family will back. One lawyer, an older woman with kind eyes, said the thing I've never forgotten. She said, "Miss Carter, you can be completely right and still lose everything. Being right isn't a strategy, it's just a feeling. What's your plan?" I didn't have a plan. I had 31,000 reasons to be furious and no way to make any of them matter. So they won. In 3 weeks, they won. My grandmother was told I'd hurt her. The family was told I'd stolen from her. I was locked out of the house, out of her life, and out of the story, recast as the villain in a play I hadn't known was being written. And here is the thing I did next, the thing that no one in that living room today knew about, the thing that 6 years of their lie was built directly on top of like a house built over a buried spring. I let them think they'd won, and then very quietly I started to pay. Here's how that happened. And I promise you it's not the noble movie version because I wasn't noble, I was cornered. About 2 months after they locked me out, I got a phone call from a woman named Marisol who worked at the assisted living place my parents had just moved my grandmother into. Marisol wasn't supposed to call me. I'd slipped her my number in those first weeks, back when I could still get in the door as the granddaughter who visited, because I'm a bookkeeper and I always want a name and a number for everything. She called me on her lunch break from the parking lot, and she was scared, and she said, "I don't know if I should be telling you this, but somebody should tell somebody. They're moving Vivian." My parents were moving her, out of the decent place with the sunroom and the music therapy and into a cheaper facility 2 towns over, a place that had a wall of complaints online and a smell you could describe. And of course they were. Every month my grandmother stayed somewhere nice was a month that ate into money they'd rather keep. The math of their cruelty was very simple. A cheaper bed for her was more cash for them. And I want to be honest about the trap I was in, because it's the whole reason the next 6 years looked the way they looked. I had no legal standing. I had no key, no power of attorney, no complaining witness, no proof anyone official would act on. If I called the state and reported elder abuse, the investigation would land on the son who raised the alarm, and my grandmother would tell them she trusted him, and the file would close, and my parents would know exactly who'd opened it. And the one person who would pay for that was the woman in the bed, so I couldn't fight them for her. I've made my peace with a lot of things, but I've never fully made peace with that. I couldn't fight them for her. What I could do was smaller and quieter, and it took me a long time to even see it. I couldn't stop them from moving her out of the good place, but I could keep the good place from letting her go. I called the nice facility, the one with the sunroom, before my parents' transfer paperwork went through. I asked what it would cost to hold her room and cover the balance her long-term care insurance didn't. The woman on the phone gave me a number that made my stomach drop. $4,200 a month, every month, indefinitely. I made about $95,000 a year back then, good money for a senior bookkeeper, and more than half of it was about to disappear every year into a room for a woman my own family swore I'd robbed. So I made it fit the only ways you can. I sold my car, I took night clients and did their books until 2 a.m. I emptied the savings I'd spent my 20s building. I made it work because the alternative was letting them win. I set up a small trust account, an escrow, in a name that wasn't obviously mine, because I knew if my mother ever saw my name on a payment, she'd tear the whole thing down out of spite. I funded it, and I called the facility administrator and I made her a deal. I said, "Do not discharge Vivian Carter. Whatever her family tells you about moving her, whatever forms they bring, you tell them the room and the care are being privately covered, and there is no financial reason to move her. You do not tell them by whom. You send the family the paperwork that shows her balance is zero, and you let them think a good deal fell in their lap, and you keep her exactly where the sun comes through that window in the afternoon. And that is what we did for nearly 5 years. My parents thought that they'd won a small windfall. As far as they knew, some insurance quirk or state program was covering the mother they wanted to warehouse, and it saved them the trouble of moving her. And they never once asked too many questions, because people who are stealing from you rarely examine a gift too closely. They told the family they were paying for Nana's care. They said it at every dinner. They said it, I would later learn, at the funeral. We pay for everything. Reese took her money and ran, and we pay for everything. I was paying for everything. $4,200 a month for 58 months, out of an escrow account with a name on it that wasn't quite mine, into a facility that kept a woman in a room with good light, while her own son told the world he was the one keeping her there. I never got the credit. That was the point. If I'd wanted credit, I'd have made noise, and noise would have gotten her moved. So I bought her silence with my silence. I paid for the sunroom by disappearing. And every month, when the statement came, I read it the way she taught me to read a statement, line by line. And every month there was one line I read twice, the payment out. $4,200 from me to her. Money flowing one direction, month after month after month, a small, steady river running the exact opposite way of the story my family was telling. I want you to hold on to the direction of that river, because it's going to matter more than anything else I tell you tonight. The whole world in that living room believed money had flowed out of my grandmother and into me. Out of Nana, into Reese, the thief. Remember the shape of that river, because at the end of this, I'm going to turn it around in front of all of them. No. Now, keeping a secret that size is not one brave decision you make once. I wish people understood that. It's not a single night where you decide to be good. It's 6 years of small, terrified decisions, most of them made at 2 a.m, and I want to tell you about the 2 that almost cost me everything, because they're the reason I was so careful, and being careful is the reason the folder on that kitchen table existed at all. The first almost disaster came in the 2nd year. My mother, whatever else she is, was raised by a bookkeeper too, and some of it stuck. One day she actually looked at a statement. The facility, per my instructions, kept sending the family a balance summary that showed my grandmother's account with them sitting at 0, paid in full, no balance due. For a long time, nobody questioned it. But that second winter, my mother apparently sat down and thought, for the first time, wait, nobody's paying this. Her insurance doesn't cover a place this nice. So who is? I found out because Marisol called me from the parking lot, and this time she wasn't scared for my grandmother. She was scared for me. She said, Reese, your mother called the front office today. She asked point blank who's covering Vivian's balance. She wanted a name. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Because if my mother got a name, if she pulled that thread, everything unraveled. She'd know I was alive in my grandmother's life. She'd move her out of spite alone. And she might figure out how and come after the money or the arrangement or Marisol's job. The administrator, God bless her, had done exactly what I'd paid her to do. She'd told my mother it was covered by a supplemental arrangement and that privacy rules meant she couldn't discuss the payer, which was true and maddening, and it held. But it wouldn't hold forever against a determined woman. So that week I did something that cost me a lawyer's fee I couldn't afford. I retitled the whole escrow. I moved it behind a small entity, a plain little single-member company with a boring name, opened at a different bank, so that if anyone ever traced a payment, it dead-ended at a business, not at Reese Carter. I turned my love for my grandmother into a corporate shell so my own mother couldn't find it. That's a strange sentence to say out loud, but that's what the world had made of us. For 7 days I was sure it was over. I checked my phone every hour waiting for the call that said she'd found me. The call never came. My mother hit the privacy wall, got bored or distracted, and let it go. She went back to telling everyone she was the one paying, and I went back to paying. But I never forgot how close it came, and after that I documented everything, every transfer, every date, every phone log with the facility, because I'd learned that the truth doesn't survive on its own. You have to keep it somewhere. The second almost disaster wasn't about the money, it was about my face. Year 3, there was a wedding. My cousin Delia got married, and the whole family went, and I went, because staying away would have looked like exactly the guilt they'd assigned me. I sat at the back, I kept my head down. And during the toasts, my mother stood up. She didn't say my name. She never did in public. That was her genius. She let the shape of the absence do the work. She raised a glass to family that shows up, to the ones who don't disappear when things get hard, who sit with our elders and hold their hands at the end instead of running off with what they can carry. And she looked, for just a flicker, at the back of the room, at me, and the whole family knew who the toast was really about. And I sat there with my grandmother's care coming out of my account on the 5th of that very month, and I said nothing. I want you to understand how close I came to standing up. I had it in my mouth. I almost stood up in the middle of my cousin's wedding and said, "You want to know who pays for her window? You want to know who sits with her on Thursdays? Ask me, ask the facility, pull the records." I almost burned the whole thing down for the pleasure of being believed for 30 seconds. And then I thought about what my mother would do the Monday after. She'd move her, out of the light, into the place with the smell, out of spite, that same week. And I sat back down and I let her toast me as the villain, because being believed was a luxury and my grandmother's window was a necessity, and I had learned to tell the two apart. But something happened at that wedding that mattered later. Delia, the bride, followed me out to the parking lot. She was still in her dress. And she said, awkward, half-drunk, kind, "Reese, I don't totally get what happened with you and your folks. But I remember you and Nana. I remember you two with the checkbook. I don't know. It just never all added up for me." And then somebody called her back inside and she went, and I stood in a parking lot in a rented dress and cried. Because for the first time in 3 years, one person in my family had said the numbers didn't add up. Hold on to Delia, she comes back. And there was one more person I want you to know about, because she's the reason I knew what to listen for in that living room 6 years later. Sometime in that 3rd year, I found a lawyer named Corinne, an elder law attorney, older, blunt, the kind who's seen every ugly family in the county twice. I couldn't afford her, so I paid her in small pieces to just advise me once or twice a year on what I could and couldn't do. And every year the answer was the same. You still can't act. You have no standing, no witness, no access. Wait. But one year Corinne told me something I wrote down and kept, and it's the whole spine of what happened at that memorial. She said, "Here's what you learn doing this long enough. Honest people can afford a simple story. Liars can't. A lie has to do 2 jobs at once, and sooner or later, the 2 jobs contradict each other. Your parents are going to need your grandmother to be sane when it helps them, and senile when it doesn't. They're going to need her competent to sign the things they want, and incompetent to sign the things they don't. They can't have both, but they'll try, because they always try. So you keep every date, Reese. Every single date. Don't fight them on feelings, you'll lose. Fight them on the calendar. One day they'll tell you 2 things that can't both be true on the same day, and on that day you'll win, and not 1 minute before. Fight them on the calendar. I kept every date, and I waited, without much hope, for the day they'd need my grandmother sane and senile at the same time. 6 years later, my mother stood in a living room and said, "Spring of 2024, and I heard Corinne's voice, and I knew the day had finally come. For the first 2 years I visited. I couldn't visit as her granddaughter, not really, because if my parents ever got a report that I'd been there, they'd move her or make trouble, and Marisol would lose her job. So I visited as a stranger. I'd sign the guest book with a made-up name, a friend from the old neighborhood, and I'd sit with her for an hour on a Thursday when I knew my family wouldn't come, and I'd hold her hand. At first she knew me. Those were the good visits and the hard ones both, because knowing me, she'd ask why I didn't come more, and I couldn't tell her that showing up was the one thing that might get her hurt. So I let her think I was busy. I let my own grandmother think I was neglecting her, because the truth was too dangerous to hand a woman whose memory now leaked. She'd forgive a granddaughter who was busy. She couldn't safely keep a secret about a granddaughter who was paying. And then, in the 3rd year, she stopped knowing me. I'd come in and she'd smile the polite smile you give a nice stranger, and she'd tell me stories about her granddaughter Reese, who was such a good girl, who used to sit on her lap and read the ledger. She'd tell me about me, to me, and not know she was doing it. "My Reese has a gift with numbers," she told me one afternoon, patting my hand, a stranger's hand. "She'll take care of things. She always does." I'd drive home from those visits and pull over on the shoulder of the highway because I couldn't see the road. There was one Thursday I've never told anyone about. It was maybe the 4th year, a bad month, and when I came in, she didn't just fail to know me, she was afraid of me. She pulled her hand back and she pressed the call button, and when Marisol came in, my grandmother pointed at me with a shaking finger and said, "That woman is here to take my money. Watch her. She's after my accounts." And I stood there while my grandmother, the one person on this earth I'd bankrupted myself to protect, accused me of the exact crime my mother had invented, in almost the exact words, because somewhere in the wreck of her memory, that story had gotten in too. My mother's lie had traveled all the way into my grandmother's broken mind and come out of her own mouth, at me, on a Thursday, with a call button in her hand. I didn't defend myself. You can't. There's no arguing with a frightened woman who's forgotten you. I just said softly, "You're right to watch your money. A woman should always read her own statement. Your granddaughter taught me that." And something in her face flickered, just for a second, at the shape of her own old lesson coming back to her from a stranger. And she let Marisol settle her, and I left early and sat in my car in that parking lot for an hour. And on the 5th of that month, the auto pay went out the same as always, $4,200, into the care of a woman who'd spent our last visit certain I was there to rob her. That's what I mean when I say there was no reward in it. Some months, the only thing that thanked me was the number on the statement, going out, the right direction, on time. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about paying for someone who's forgotten you. There's no reward in it. There's no moment where she squeezes your hand and understands. Some months she was frightened of me. Some months she thought I was her sister. The auto pay went out the same on the frightened months, and the sister months, and the months she was too far gone to have a mood at all. $4,200 on the 5th of every month for a woman who could no longer have told you my name if her life depended on it. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this so you'll think I'm a saint. I'm telling you because 6 years later, in that living room, my mother was going to stand in front of 40 people and call me the daughter who threw the family away, who abandoned a sick old woman and took her money. And I need you to understand the exact shape of the truth she was standing on top of. She was standing on 58 wire transfers. She was standing on a sunroom. She was standing on every Thursday I signed a fake name in a guest book to sit with a woman who thought I was nice for a stranger. That's the lie. Now let me tell you how I found out about the letter. 14 months ago, my grandmother had a stroke, and after that, she went down fast. I got the call from Marisol, off the clock, from the parking lot, the way I always did. She said, "You should come. I think it's soon. Come at night. Come after 8. Nobody from the family comes at night." So I came at night, and for 3 weeks, at the very end of her life, I got my grandmother back in pieces. And one of those nights, I almost got caught, and I want to tell you about it, because it's the last time the whole arrangement nearly came apart before she died, and because it's the night she started doing the thing that would save me a year later. It was late, past 9, and I was sitting by the bed with her hand in mine when I heard the front doors of the facility and voices in the hall, and one of the voices was my mother's. They'd gotten a call that she was declining, and they'd come, at night, the one time I'd always been safe. I had maybe 20 seconds. Marisol appeared in the doorway, white as the sheets, and mouthed the word, "Go." And I went out the side door by the garden, the way she'd shown me once, just in case. And I stood in the cold in the dark on the other side of a window and watched my mother sit down in the chair I'd just been sitting in and take the hand I'd just been holding. I want you to picture that. I paid for that room. I'd sat in that chair 100 nights. And I stood outside in the dark, like a trespasser, while the woman who'd stolen from her performed a bedside vigil for whoever might be watching. That's the whole 6 years in one window, if you want it. Me outside in the cold, paying, and them inside in the warm, taking credit. But here's the thing my grandmother did, and I only understood it later. On the good nights, the surfacing nights, she'd started asking me to bring her things. Her old checkbook, a statement. "The blue folder from the closet at the house," she said once, though the house was 2 towns away, and she hadn't been there in years. She was trying to gather something. Her mind knew it had a job to finish, even when it couldn't remember what the job was. And one night she gripped my wrist and said, clear as a bell, "I went to the bank." Did I tell you I went to the bank? I made them give me all of it. Every slip. I saw his hand pretending to be mine. And then it was gone. and she was asking me if the school buses had come yet. I thought it was the wandering. I didn't understand that my grandmother, in one of her last lucid stretches, had walked into a bank branch, proven who she was, and requested a certified copy of every withdrawal ever made from her elder care fund because she'd finally seen for herself what I'd tried to tell her 6 years before. I didn't understand that she'd sealed those certified copies away together with the codicil she'd signed years earlier, the one she'd made in secret right after I first came to her with the slips, back when her hand was still steady and her mind was still all the way her own. I just held her hand and told her the buses were coming. The dying sometimes surface. I don't know the medicine of it, but I know it happened. There were nights she was gone completely, and then there was one night, maybe 10 days before the end, when I walked in and she was sitting up, and she looked at me, really looked at me, and her eyes changed, and she said, "Reese," like a door opening, and I fell apart at the foot of her bed. We had that night. One night. She held my face in both her hands, and her hands were so light, and she said, "I know what you did. I know what you've been doing." And I thought she meant something confused, some drifting thing, and I said, "Nana, it's okay. Don't worry about anything." And she got, for a moment, sharp like the bookkeeper she'd been, sharp like the woman who taught me a lady reads her own statement, and she said, "No, listen to me while I have it. I know what he did, and I know what you did, and I fixed it. I fixed it before I forgot how." I didn't understand her. I thought it was the wandering. I held her hand and told her she'd fixed everything. "Sure, everything's fixed. Rest now." And she looked at me with something I can only call mischief, the ghost of the woman who used to hide birthday presents so well I'd give up looking. And she said one more thing. She said, "You know where I keep the real one? Same place we put your picture, when you were 5. Then she was tired, and she drifted, and by the next night she didn't know me again, and 11 days later she was gone. And I didn't get to go to the funeral because my parents planned it, and I only heard about it after, from a cousin who assumed I already knew and couldn't understand why I hadn't come. So I never got to ask her what she meant. "You know where I keep the real one. Same place we put your picture when you were 5. I thought about it for a year. Some nights it kept me up. The real what? What picture? We took 1,000 pictures. I turned it over and over and got nothing, and eventually I filed it under the cruel category of things the dying say that the living never get to solve. And then the invitation came for the first anniversary memorial, at the house, and I almost didn't go. I want you to know how close I came to not going. My hand was on the trash can with that envelope, but she was my grandmother, and it was her day, and I decided I could stand one afternoon of being pitied in a room full of people who'd believed a lie for her. I did not know, driving to Ohio, that I was about to walk into a living room and see my own 5th birthday frame propped up on a shelf like a shrine, with my grandmother's last letter matted inside it, and finally, a year too late and exactly on time, understand every word she'd said. "Same place we put your picture, when you were 5. The frame." She'd hidden something in the frame. Before I tell you what my hands found behind that letter, and before I tell you why my mother screamed and lunged across a room full of her own relatives to stop me, I need you to hold on to that one phrase I gave you, the direction of the river. If you have ever paid a price nobody ever thanked you for, if you've ever done the right thing in the dark where no one could see it, then you already know why it matters so much which way the money runs. Stay with me, because from here on, everything my family built over 6 years is going to start coming down, and I promise you, it does not come down by luck. Let me walk you back into that room. So there I was, coat off, thank yous handed out, my eyes stuck to that frame on the shelf, and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Because now I knew, or I thought I knew. Same place we put your picture, when you were 5. That was the frame. Whatever she'd hidden, it was 15 feet away from me, behind a piece of matted cream paper that my whole family treated like a keepsake. And I could not just walk over and take it apart. 40 people were watching me the way you watch a dog that bit somebody once. If I'd crossed that room and started prying at the back of that frame, my mother would have had me out the door in 30 seconds, and she'd have been right to, by the story everyone believed. The thief, going for the one precious thing Nana left. I needed the room. I needed all of them looking, and I needed them to have picked a side so hard that when it flipped all the way. My mother, it turned out, was about to hand me exactly that. But before she did, two things happened in the first hour of that memorial that told me the ground was not as solid under my parents as they thought, and I want you to have them because they're the reason I didn't just walk out. The first was Delia. I slipped into the kitchen about 40 minutes in, mostly to get away from the pity, and Delia was in there, older now, a baby on her hip, and when she saw me, her face did something the rest of them hadn't. It softened without going sad. She said, "Reese," and she meant it like a name, not like a diagnosis. And then, while she jiggled the baby, she said the thing that I've carried ever since. "She asked for you," Delia said, "at the end. I came to visit her, near the end, and she kept asking for Reese, kept saying, 'Is Reese coming? Tell Reese to come.' And Aunt Diane kept telling her, 'You didn't want to come, that you'd said no.'" Delia looked at me. "But that's the thing. Nana didn't ask for people who abandoned her. She asked for you. Sick as she was, confused as she was, some part of her was still asking for the granddaughter who was supposed to be the one who left. That never sat right with me. Why would she cry for the one who ran?" I couldn't answer her. If I'd opened my mouth, I'd have told her everything, right there over a baby and a plate of deviled eggs, and it wasn't the place. But I filed it, because Delia had just told me, without knowing it, that my grandmother had spent her last weeks asking for the person my mother had spent 6 years erasing. The lie had a hole in it, and the hole was shaped like me, and at least one person in that family had already noticed. The second thing happened because I went looking for a bathroom and took a wrong turn past my grandfather's old study. The door was cracked and my father was in there, and he was on the phone, and he didn't know I was in the hall. And I heard him say in a low, businesslike voice I recognized from 100 childhood arguments about money, "No, Gerald, it's handled. The family's on board. We do the memorial, everybody has a good cry, and then I bring up the sale while the mood's soft. Nobody's going to fight it. The old lady's gone, the estate's clean, and Reese has got nothing but that letter, and a letter's not a will." A pause. Yeah, the letter's fine. Let her wave it around. It just makes her look pathetic. Let her. That's what I'm counting on. Let her wave it around. It just makes her look pathetic. I stood in that hallway and I understood the whole play. They wanted me to make a scene about the letter. It was part of the plan. The pathetic, estranged daughter clutching a sentimental note, making her grandmother's memorial about her own grievance, while the sensible family voted to sell and move on. My father wasn't afraid of the letter. He was counting on it. He thought the framed letter on that shelf was his best prop, and mine was my worst. Neither of us knew yet that the letter had a back. I want to be honest about what I felt in that hallway, because it wasn't triumph. It was something closer to grief. I heard my father call his dead mother the old lady and describe her memorial as a soft mood to close a sale in, and I thought, there's no version of this where I get a father. I'd known it for 6 years, but knowing it and hearing it are different, and I heard it. Whatever happened next, I was not going to walk out of that house with a family. That had been decided a long time ago, in a kitchen over a fan of withdrawal slips. The only thing left to decide was whether I'd walk out with the truth. So I went back to the living room. I found a spot near the shelf, close to the frame, close enough to touch, and I waited. I let them have their memorial. I let Ray tell a story about Nana's pie. I let my mother dab her eyes. I even let myself, for a few minutes, actually grieve her in that room among people who didn't deserve to grieve her with me, because she deserved to be grieved and I was the only one there doing it honestly. And then my father tapped his glass, right on schedule, and started his little speech about sacrifice. And I felt the plan click into motion, his plan. And I thought of Corinne saying, "Fight them on the calendar." And I thought of Delia saying, "Why would she cry for the one who ran?" And I thought of my grandmother's voice saying, "Turn me over, the rest is behind me." And I understood that everything I'd carried for 6 years had been carrying me to this exact room, this exact afternoon, this exact frame at my elbow. Because my parents hadn't gathered 40 relatives just to grieve, I understand that now. They'd gathered them to close a case. There was a thing they wanted to do that day, and they needed witnesses for it, and they dressed it up as a memorial so nobody would see the transaction underneath. They wanted to sell the house, my grandmother's house, the one we were standing in. The ancestral place, 4 generations of Carters, the warped shelf and the leak from '99, and the kitchen table where she taught me to read a ledger. My father wanted to sell it and split the money, and to do that cleanly, he needed the family's blessing. And to get the family's blessing, he needed everyone to agree on one last thing, that Nana's estate belonged to him, and that the daughter who'd stolen from her and run had no claim to anything and no business objecting. So about 40 minutes in, my father tapped a glass. He gave a little speech. He was good at it. He'd had practice. He talked about sacrifice. He talked about how he and my mother had carried Nana on their backs for years while certain people made themselves scarce. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. Everyone else did. And then he said the estate was settled, the paperwork was in order, and it was time as a family to let go of the house and move forward. And he asked, in that warm, reasonable voice, whether anyone had any objection. And I said, I do. The room went very quiet. My voice wasn't loud. I've never been loud in that room. I just said it. 2 words, and 40 heads turned, and my mother's face did a thing I'd been waiting 6 years to see. A flicker, a crack, there and gone. I don't think the estate is settled, I said. I don't think you have the right to sell this house. And I think before anyone signs anything, we should read what Nana actually wanted. I saw my father's jaw set. I saw my mother's hand find his arm. And then my mother did the thing that she thought would end me and instead handed me the knife. She smiled. She turned to the room, sorrowful, patient, and she said, of course you'd say that, sweetheart. You always did think you knew better than everyone." And then, to the family, "She's going to bring up that old letter, the one Mama supposedly changed at the end. I think it's time everyone knew the truth about the state Mama was in those last couple of years, so we can put this to rest with some compassion. Rhonda?" And that's when my Aunt Rhonda stood up. Rhonda is my father's younger sister. She's not a cruel woman, and I want to say that clearly because it matters for what happens next. She's a weak one, which is different, and more useful to people like my parents. She stood up dabbing her eyes and she told the room in a trembling voice that she loved her mother and that it broke her heart, but the family needed to face facts. Mama hadn't been herself at the end. Mama had been confused. Mama, she said, didn't know what year it was, didn't recognize her own children, couldn't have told you what she had in the bank. By the last couple of years, Rhonda said, Mama wasn't competent to manage her own affairs. That's just the sad truth. So any letter, any change, anything she supposedly signed near the end, God love her, it doesn't mean anything. She wasn't in her right mind. Then my mother produced a document. She'd had it ready, a folder on the sideboard, right where the good napkins were. She opened it and held up a will. A newer will, she said, dated more recently than that old letter Reese wants to make a fuss about, properly typed, signed by a lawyer, a man named Gerald Mott, who did work for my father's business, and who, my mother said, had helped Mama get her affairs in order when she still could. This will, she said, left everything to my father, as the son who'd sacrificed, and it was the real and final word, and the other thing, the letter, was just a sad scrap from a confused old woman that they'd kept out of sentiment. And the room turned. I felt it turn. I want to describe that feeling to you because if you've been the truth teller in a family, you know it, and if you haven't, you need to understand how physical it is. It's like the floor tilting. 40 people, and a moment before some of them at least had a question in their eyes, and now the questions closed, one by one, like windows before a storm. A lawyer signed it. Rhonda cried. Nana was confused. Case closed. Poor Reese, still fighting, still can't let go, still making her grandmother's memorial about herself. Uncle Ray put his hand on my shoulder, gently, the way you steer someone. "Reese," he said low, "honey, maybe this isn't the day. Maybe you should get some air." They were walking me to the door. Kindly. That's the part that guts me even now. They were escorting me out of my grandmother's house with compassion, and every one of them thought they were being decent. And I was 6 feet from the door, and the frame on the shelf was 30 feet behind me and getting farther. And I thought for one whole terrible second that I had lost. Again. That she'd hidden the truth so well that it would sit behind a piece of glass on a shelf while they sold the house out from under it, and I'd never even get to open it. If you had to bet right now on how a woman with no lawyer and no key and 40 relatives against her turns this around, what would you guess? Before you hear it, put your prediction in the comments. I mean it, guess, because I want you to see whether you catch it before they did. Here's your only clue, and it's the same one my grandmother left me. They didn't lose because of the letter. They lost because of a date. Because as Uncle Ray's hand steered me toward the door, my mind, the part of me that counts things even when the rest of me is drowning, snagged on something Rhonda had said, and I stopped walking. I stopped, and Uncle Ray's hand slid off my shoulder, and I turned around and I said, "Rhonda, I want to make sure I understand you. You said Nana wasn't competent to manage her own money. When? Give me a year. When exactly did she lose the ability to handle her finances?" Rhonda blinked. She looked at my mother. That look told me everything. The little glance for permission, but the damage was already loading, because you cannot unask a question in a room full of people, and everyone had heard me ask for a year. And my mother, who is smart, but who had gotten comfortable, who had just watched the room fold toward her and was feeling the old easy power, made her one mistake. She answered for Rhonda. She wanted the incompetence pinned early and hard to bury the letter as deep as possible. So she said it with confidence. "Reese, everyone here knows Mama was gone by the last 2 years. She couldn't have managed a checkbook since at least the spring of 2024. That's not cruelty, that's just the truth, and I'm sorry you weren't around to see it. Spring of 2024. She said it to the whole room. She wanted a wall. She built me a door. Because I keep books for a living. And there is a set of documents I had never been able to use, could never get standing to challenge, that had sat in my files for 6 years like a loaded thing with no trigger. Withdrawal slips from my grandmother's eldercare fund, slips with her signature on them, slips that kept coming, month after month, well past the spring of 2024. Slips dated the summer of 2024, the fall of 2024, as recently as 3 months before she died. Every one of them signed, supposedly, by a woman my mother had just told 40 witnesses could not sign a competent thing after the spring of 2024. So either my grandmother was competent enough to authorize those withdrawals, in which case she was competent enough to write a letter and change a will, and their whole story about the confused old woman collapsed. Or she was not competent after the spring of 2024, exactly as my mother had just sworn to a room full of family, in which case every one of those signatures on those withdrawal slips was forged. There was no third door. My mother had just, in front of 40 people, personally certified the exact fact I needed to prove that the withdrawals from my grandmother's account were fraud. To bury the letter, she'd notarized the theft. I didn't say all of that yet. I'm telling you now so you can watch it happen with the lights on. In the room, I said only one small thing, and I said it very quietly, and I felt the temperature change the second it left my mouth. I said, "Okay, spring of 2024. I want everyone to remember that she said that. Spring of 2024, Nana couldn't manage her own money." And then I turned, and I walked, not to the door, but past all of them, across the whole length of that living room, to the shelf. Nobody stopped me. I think they were too surprised. A room braced to walk me out the door didn't know what to do with a woman walking the wrong way. My mother started to say my name, "Reese," but I was already there, and my hands were already on the frame. I lifted it off the shelf. It was lighter than I expected and heavier than I can say. My 5th birthday frame, brass corners gone dull, and behind the glass, my grandmother's handwriting, the little sailboat V's I'd have known anywhere. "Put that down," my father said. His voice had lost the warm, reasonable thing. "Reese, put it down. That's not yours to handle." "It's addressed to me," I said. And it was. I hadn't known until I held it. The family had been reading the framed side for a year, the pretty side, a few lines everyone assumed were a general farewell to all of them. But at the top, small, where the mat had covered it and nobody had bothered to take the frame apart, it said in her hand, "For Reese. To be read when I'm gone. Out loud, in the room." Out loud in the room. She'd even told me how to do it. So I read it out loud in the room. "My Reese," I read, and my voice only shook a little. "If someone is reading this to the family, then I'm gone, and you did what I asked. Good girl. You always did the hard things quietly. That was your trouble and your gift." I know what they told everyone about you. I know they said you took my money and left me. I let them think I believed it, at the end, because it kept you safe, and because I was already forgetting, and I could not always tell which of us was in the room. Forgive me for the times I looked at you and called you a stranger. You were never a stranger. You were the only one who stayed. Everyone in that room thinks you left me. Child, you paid for the window, you paid for the light. I don't know how you did it, and I never let on that I knew, but I knew. A woman who kept books her whole life knows when a bill is quietly getting paid by someone who loves her. Every good month I had, you bought. You bought them one at a time in the dark, and you never once let me thank you. I had to stop. The room had gone completely silent. Not the fold against me silence from before. A different silence, the kind where 40 people are recalculating at once. I looked up and I found my mother's face, and I kept reading, straight at her. They will tell you I was confused. Maybe by now I am. But I wrote this while I could still read my own name, and I did the last thing your grandfather would have wanted me to do. I put it right. I put it where only you would look. You know where I keep the real one. Same place we put your picture, when you were 5. Go and get it, Reese. Turn me over. The rest is behind me. Turn me over. The rest is behind me. I turned the frame over. Now I want to be honest with you about my hands, because a voice can't show you what a picture would. My hands were not steady. It took me 3 tries to bend back the little brass tabs that held the backing board. And the whole time, my mother was crossing the room. She started slow, saying my name. Reese, honey, Reese, that's enough now. Let's not. The compassion voice, the steering voice. And then she saw the backing board come loose in my hands. And I watched her understand. Because here's what my mother knew that the rest of the room didn't. My mother knew there had once been a codicil. She and my father had known 6 years ago that my grandmother's original lawyer had drawn up something that changed everything, cut them out, and named the reason. They'd found out when my grandmother switched lawyers not long after, and they'd assumed they'd bet the whole house on it, that switching lawyers meant the codicil was dead. Revoked. Destroyed. For 6 years, they'd slept soundly on the belief that the dangerous document no longer existed anywhere in the world. And now they were watching me peel back the cardboard behind a letter that said the rest is behind me. My mother stopped saying my name and lunged. I mean that word. She lunged across the last 6 feet of that living room, past my aunt, knocking a glass off the sideboard, both hands out, not for the letter, for the back of the frame, for the thing she suddenly understood had never been destroyed at all. My father grabbed for her arm and missed. Uncle Ray said, "Diane." My mother, who for 6 years had played the grieving, patient, wronged woman with perfect control, threw all of it away in front of 40 relatives to claw at a piece of cardboard in my hands. You don't do that over a sentimental letter. Every person in that room knew in that second that you do not knock over a glass and throw your whole body across a room to stop someone from reading a keepsake, she told on herself with her hands. Before a single legal word was spoken, my mother's own body had informed 40 witnesses that whatever was behind that frame was worth destroying herself to stop. She didn't reach it. I turned my shoulder, the way you box out for a rebound, an ordinary human reflex, and the backing board came free and folded inside it. In a plastic sleeve my grandmother's careful hands had sealed was a document, several pages. And on the first page, near the top, a stamp and a raised seal, and the words I had waited 6 years and had stopped believing I'd ever see. A codicil, notarized, dated, signed with a little sailboat V. I held it up over my head, out of my mother's reach, and I said, loud now, finally loud. The only time I've been loud in that room in my whole life. Everybody sit down. My grandmother wrote one more thing, and it's notarized. So let's find out whether she was confused. Here is what my grandmother's codicil said, and I read every word of it to that room because she'd earned every word. It said that she, Vivian Carter, of sound mind, was amending the disposition of her estate and her trust. It said she was removing her son and his wife entirely, as beneficiaries and as anyone with authority over her affairs. And then, in the kind of plain sentence only a lifelong bookkeeper would think to put in a legal document, it said why. It said, because they have been taking money from my elder care fund without my permission, and because I have seen withdrawal slips bearing a signature that is meant to look like mine and is not mine. She wrote that. A woman my mother had just sworn was too confused to manage a checkbook had, years before she went, and while her mind was still sharp, sat down with a notary and calmly described the exact crime in the exact language that I'd found in that drawer 6 years earlier and had never been able to make anyone believe. And she left the house and the trust to me. The denials came fast, and I'd expected them, and I want you to hear how thin they'd gotten. My father, gray in the face, said it wasn't valid, it was old, it was the confused version, they had a newer will. My mother, breathing hard, said I'd forged it, I'd planted it, this was all some scheme of mine. Look at her, she's had this planned. That one almost made me laugh. 6 years of me being the family thief, and now, holding a notarized document in my grandmother's hand, I was the family forger too. So I answered the newer will, calmly. The way she taught me to answer a number I didn't trust. You check the date. You said this newer will is more recent, I said to my mother, and I held it next to the codicil so the room could see both. That's your whole case. It's newer, so it wins. Fine. Then it was signed after the codicil. And you just told all of these people that Nana couldn't manage her own affairs after the spring of 2024. So which is it? Either she was competent when she signed your will, in which case she was competent when she signed hers, and hers is dated first and cuts you out, or she wasn't competent after spring 2024, in which case your newer will, signed after that, is the worthless one. You don't get to have her sane for your document and senile for hers. Pick one, in front of everybody. Pick one. My mother opened her mouth and nothing came out, because there was no answer. There had never been an answer. The trap wasn't mine. She'd built it herself the moment she needed Nana confused enough to bury a letter. And she'd built it in front of witnesses, and now it had closed on both her documents at once. But I wasn't done, because a codicil proves she wanted to cut them out. It doesn't, by itself, prove they stole. And I had come to that house to prove they stole. Not for me. For the woman who spent the last clear hours of her mind making sure the proof would outlive her. So I reached into my bag, and I took out the folder I'd brought with me to Ohio, the folder I'd been carrying in and out of that state for 6 years, waiting for a day I'd stopped believing would come. And I laid it open on my grandmother's kitchen table, and I called the room to look. You've all been told a story about a river of money, I said. You've been told it flowed out of Nana and into me, that I drained her accounts and ran. Every one of you has repeated some version of that. So let's look at where the money actually went. Let's read the statements. She'd want us to read the statements. The first thing I put down was a certified account history for the Elder Care Fund, Vivian's fund, the one my grandfather built so she'd never be a burden. And I walked them down the column the way she'd walk me down a column when I was a girl, and I read the withdrawals out loud. 2,000, 4,000, no receipt, 1,200, on and on. And then I read the dates. Summer 2024, October 2024, January 2025, February 2025, 3 months before she died, everyone with a signature at the bottom. Rhonda, I said, you told us she couldn't sign a competent thing after spring 2024, so who signed these? Because somebody was still emptying this account 11 months after the day you all agreed her hand wasn't hers anymore. Either she was fine, and your whole story is a lie, or that's her name in someone else's hand, and that's forgery, and that's a felony, and it kept happening right up until she died. Rhonda started to cry, the real kind now, and she looked at my father, and this time she didn't ask permission. She just said, small, I didn't know it went that far. Wayne, you told me she was just confused. You didn't tell me you were still... And my father said her name like a door slamming, Rhonda. And it was too late, because she'd said still. And everyone heard still. That's the thing about a lie you make other people carry. You never fully control the people carrying it. And then I put down the second set of statements. My statements. The escrow. Nearly 5 years of them. 58 lines, the 5th of every month. Now here's the river you were told about, I said. Here's the money that supposedly flowed out of Nana and into me. Watch which way it goes. And I read them the direction of the river. $4,200. Out of my account into the facility on the 5th of the month, every month, for nearly 5 years. Through the years she knew me and the years she didn't. Through the month my mother told this family I'd abandoned her, and the month after, and the month after that. I read the dates against the fund withdrawals so the room could hold both rivers at once. My parents' hands going into her account and taking, and my account going into her care and paying, month for month, the same months, opposite directions, month after month. The money never flowed out of Nana and into me, I said. It flowed out of me and into her, every single month. The daughter who threw the family away paid for your mother's window while the two of you emptied the account you told everyone you were spending on her care. You didn't pay for 1 month. I paid for 58. And the reason you never knew is the same reason I'm only telling you now. If I'd said one word, you'd have moved her out of the light. So I kept quiet, and I kept paying, and I let you call me a thief, because being called a thief was cheaper than her losing the son. Nobody spoke. 40 people. And the only sound was Rhonda crying, and somewhere near the window my cousin Delia saying very softly, "Oh my God," over and over, the way you say it when a whole year of your own certainty is coming apart in your hands. My mother made one last move. "I'll give her this. She's not a quitter." She reached across the table and put her hand flat on the escrow statements and slid them toward herself, toward the edge, toward the floor, as if she could sweep 6 years of certified banking records into a mess on the carpet and make them stop being true. It was such a small, desperate animal thing. My father grabbed her wrist, not to comfort her, to stop her. Because even he understood finally that a woman clawing bank statements off a table in front of 40 witnesses was not helping their case. She was closing it. And that was the moment it was truly over. Not when I read the codicil, not even when the direction of the river turned. It was when my father grabbed my mother's wrist to stop her destroying evidence, and the two of them froze like that, hand around wrist, over a table of proof in front of the whole family, and every person in that room finally saw the shape of the thing they'd refused to see for 6 years. Nobody had to say the word guilty. Their own 4 hands, reaching for the wrong things, had said it for them. Before I tell you how it ended, and what I decided to do with a house and a trust and a family that had spent 6 years walking me to the door, I want to ask you to do one thing. If you have ever been made the villain so somebody else could keep being the hero, take a breath right now, wherever you are, and let yourself feel that you were not the villain. You knew. You always knew. Say it in the comments if you need to hear it out loud from someone. And then stay with me for the last few minutes, because what you do after you win is the only part that's really yours. I did not call the police that afternoon. I want to say that plainly, because I know some of you are waiting for the part where I have them hauled out in front of the family. It didn't happen like that, and I'm glad it didn't, because the thing I've learned is that when a lie is finally standing in the open, you don't have to push it over. You just have to stop holding it up. Everyone had been holding my parents' story up for 6 years. That afternoon, all at once, 40 people put it down, and it fell on its own. Here's how it actually unwound in the weeks after. The codicil was what the lawyers call self-proving. My grandmother, bless her careful bookkeeper's heart, hadn't just signed it in front of a notary. She'd had it done properly years before, with the notarized affidavit attached, the kind of document that doesn't need anyone to come to court and vouch for it. It proves itself, so there was nothing for my parents to attack. They couldn't put my grandmother on the stand to say she didn't mean it. She'd made sure of that back when her mind was still entirely her own, years before anyone could call it confusion. Their newer will died 3 different ways, and I want you to hear all 3, because each one is a place their own story cut its own throat. First, the date. It was signed after the codicil, which meant that for it to be valid, my grandmother had to have been competent when she signed it, which meant she'd been competent to write the codicil too, and the codicil came first and cut them out. Second, the incompetence testimony. They'd had Rhonda swear to a room full of witnesses that my grandmother wasn't competent after spring 2024, and their will was dated after that, so by their own sworn account, it was signed by a woman they'd just certified couldn't sign anything. And third, when the probate lawyer actually examined it, the newer will turned out to be missing a witness signature it legally needed, because Gerald Mott had cut a corner for a friend, the way people cut corners for friends, assuming no one would ever look. Someone looked. But the will was the small thing. The big thing was the certified withdrawal history, the one my grandmother had walked into a bank and gotten herself, that she'd sealed behind my 5th birthday photo along with the codicil. Because that history didn't just prove she'd been robbed. Combined with my mother's own words in that living room, it proved forgery. My mother had certified, in front of 40 witnesses, that my grandmother couldn't manage her affairs after spring 2024. The withdrawals kept going, in my grandmother's signature, for 11 months after that. You cannot have both. Either the signatures were hers and she was competent and the codicil stands, or she was incompetent and someone else was signing her name to empty her account, and that is a felony that continued right up until she died. I didn't have to be the one to say felony. The county has a unit for exactly this, elder financial abuse, and once the certified records existed and the forgery was on the table, it stopped being a family matter and became a case, and it moved on its own schedule without me driving it. I gave them the documents I'd kept for 6 years. My grandmother gave them the ones she'd kept in the last clear hours of her life. Between the two of us, one alive and one gone, we'd assembled the whole thing without ever being able to say a word to each other about it. That's the part that still undoes me. We were both keeping the same secret, in the same direction, for the same woman, and neither of us knew the other one was doing it. The house and the trust came to me. The probate was clean in the end, because she'd made it clean. And my father, who had gathered 40 relatives to bless the sale of his mother's house, instead had to explain to those same relatives why there was now a county investigator asking him about signatures. The family did what families do, which is split. Some of them couldn't get to me fast enough with an apology, and I could tell which apologies were about me and which were about how bad they suddenly felt. And I was gracious to all of them anyway, because Corinne once told me that the cost of grace is low, and the cost of a grudge is your whole life. And she was right about the calendar, so I decided to trust her about that too. Rhonda called me, sobbing, to say she hadn't known, that they'd told her my grandmother was just confused, and she'd repeated it because she trusted her brother, and I believed her, because a weak person who told the truth the second the truth had a witness is not the same as the people who built the lie. Uncle Ray came to the house and stood in the living room a long time and finally said, "We should have asked you, any of us. In 6 years, not one of us just asked you." And that was the truest thing anyone in my family said to me, and I told him so. And Delia, who followed me out to a parking lot in a wedding dress 3 years before and said the numbers didn't add up. Delia was the first one who called, before the will, before the investigation, before any of it was official, and all she said was, "I knew it. I'm so sorry, and I knew it, and I should have said it louder." Hold on to the Delias. Every family that scapegoats somebody has one person somewhere in the back of the room whose stomach never quite bought it. Find them. They're your evidence that you weren't crazy. My parents did not apologize. I want to be honest about that too, because I know the satisfying version of this story ends with them broken and sorry, and life mostly doesn't hand you that. My mother's position, right up until the lawyers told her to stop talking, was that I had somehow orchestrated all of it, that I was the mastermind, that a woman who'd spent 6 years silently paying for a sunroom had secretly been running a scheme to steal a house she never asked about once. It's almost a compliment, how much credit she gives me. My father just stopped speaking to me, which, after that phone call in the study, felt less like a punishment and more like the removal of a weight. There's one visit I need to tell you about because it's where I finally put down the thing I'd been carrying, and it wasn't in a courtroom or that living room. It was in a small room with good afternoon light. A few weeks after the memorial, I drove out to the facility. Not to hide this time. I signed the guest book with my own name, Reese Carter, in ink, for the first time in 6 years, and I sat in the little office with the administrator I'd made a deal with over the phone in the worst week of my life and had never once met in person. And I met Marisol in daylight, on the clock, and I hugged the woman who'd stood in a doorway and mouthed, "Go," so a family couldn't catch a granddaughter loving her grandmother. She cried. I cried. She said, "I always wondered if I did the right thing." I told her she was the reason a woman spent 6 years in the sun. I told her she'd done the only right thing in the whole story that didn't cost anybody anything, and she should carry that lightly and forever. Then I asked if I could see the room. It was somebody else's now, of course. Life moves into empty rooms. But I stood in the doorway of the room I'd paid for and never once slept near. And I looked at the window, and the afternoon light came through it exactly the way the woman on the phone had promised me it would 6 years before, when I was 28 and terrified and writing a check I couldn't afford against a future I couldn't see. The light was still doing its job. It had done its job every single afternoon, on the good days and the bad ones, whether my grandmother knew my name or not, because that was the deal. The light didn't need her to remember me. Neither, it turned out, did I. That's when I finally understood what I'd actually been buying all those years. I used to think I was buying her care. I was. But I was also buying myself the right to know, for the rest of my life, that when it counted, in the dark, where no one clapped, I did not become the thing they said I was. My mother spent 6 years telling everyone I abandoned my grandmother, and the whole time, on the 5th of every month, I was quietly making that a lie. I didn't do it to win an argument I didn't know I'd ever get to have. I did it because you don't leave. Whatever they call you, you don't leave. You just get quieter about staying. Now about the house, everyone assumed I'd sell it. My parents had assumed it, planned a whole memorial around it. And I'll be honest, part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to take the thing they tried to sell out from under my grandmother and turn it into a check and walk away and never smell that living room again. I sat with a realtor. I got the number. It was a good number. And then I thought about the kitchen table. The one where she taught me to read a ledger. The one where I laid out the withdrawal slips and asked my parents for an explanation and got a threat instead. The one where, 6 years later, I laid out the certified statements and read a room the direction of the river. That table had seen the whole thing, start to finish. It felt wrong to sell the table. So I didn't sell the house. I did something else with it, and it's the thing I actually want to be the end of this story. More than the codicil, more than the reveal, more than my mother lunging across a room and telling on herself with her own 2 hands. Because here's what 6 years taught me that I didn't know at 28. There are more of her out there. In every family, there is an old woman with a fund somebody's eyeing and a memory that's starting to leak, and children who've already started dividing her up while she's still in the room. My grandmother had me, in the dark, by accident, because I happened to be a bookkeeper who knew how to read a slip. Most of them don't have anyone. Most of them just have the version of my parents, and no version of me. I decided to change what that house was for. I took the trust my grandmother left me, the one my parents tried so hard to get their hands on, and I used part of it to start something. I called it the Vivian Carter Fund, and it does one simple, undramatic thing. It watches the money of old people in our family and our town who don't have anyone to watch it. A set of eyes on the statements. Someone who knows what a traced signature looks like, and what a reimbursement with no receipt means, and how to move quietly and fast when a fund starts bleeding. The house is its office now. There's a bookkeeper's desk in the living room, right where the shelf used to be, and on the desk, in my 5th birthday frame, is the letter, the real side out, so I read it every morning. And here's the part that matters most, the part my grandmother would have insisted on, because she never could hold a grudge as long as she could hold a hand. I invited the family to help, not all of them. I'm not a saint, and this isn't a fairy tale. But I called Delia and Ray and even Rhonda, everyone who, when the truth finally had a witness, chose the truth. I told them the door was open if they wanted to do something real for the next old woman instead of dividing up the last one. Some of them showed up. Delia runs our little intake calls. Ray fixes the leak from '99 that his father never got to. The people who turned back honestly got a family again on the other side of all of it. That was the offer. It's still the offer. My parents are not part of it, and they never will be, and that is the one boundary I will never move. Not out of revenge. I don't need revenge. Their own words in that living room did more to them than I ever could. It's just that I finally understand a thing it took me 34 years to learn. You are allowed to close a door that only ever opened onto harm. You can grieve the parents you should have had, and still refuse to keep bleeding for the ones you got. I paid for my grandmother's window for 5 years in the dark. I will not spend the next 5 paying for people who'd sell the house with her letter still in it. That account is closed. I closed it. And for the first time, closing an account felt like keeping a promise instead of breaking one. So that's the whole thing. That's the daughter who threw the family away. They stood in that living room and told 40 people the money flowed out of her and into me, and I turned the frame around, and I turned the river around, and I showed them the truth she'd sealed behind a photograph of me at 5 years old, back when she still let me hold the frame the whole way home because she trusted me not to drop it. I never dropped it. Not the frame, not her, not once, not in 5 years of Thursdays and wire transfers and a fake name in a guest book. They called me the one who left. I was the only one who stayed. And the letter on my desk, in her own hand, in her little sailboat handwriting, says exactly that. Every morning, in a house full of light, where the money finally flows the right way, and her name is on the door.